Welcome to this week's office hours session. I'm Kate Tingley, Director of Marketing here at Infinix, and I'm happy to have our Chief Product Officer, Navaneeth Nair, back with us. Welcome back, Navaneeth. It's good to have you.
Happy to be back, Kate.
Our topic for today is something that I think continues to keep a lot of providers up at night and causes a lot of headaches, and that's prior authorizations. So specifically, we're going to dive into how you can increase prior authorization approvals and reduce those auth-related denials. So let's jump right in. All right, so Navaneeth, if you could kick us off and just talk a little bit about what trends you're seeing in terms of authorizations, either with clients or just in the market.
Yeah, I think just by the sheer interest in this topic, it is very clear that the trends are worsening. I think there was only a very brief period, I would say early COVID, when there was a little bit of kind of moderation to what required prior authorization. What I'm really, and what we're seeing in our data and our system, since we have, I would say, top 15 specialties that we manage here at Infinix, we're seeing each one of those specialties kind of seeing a ramped up number of procedures that require prior authorization. We've been analyzing patterns on the kind of procedures or plans that require prior authorization from all the top national payers, including some of the local payers. And what we're really seeing is that, and it's not United versus others problem. It seems to be broad, and it seems like there is a broader consensus on the number of procedures being increased by all the payers. It's not limited to certain big national payers or certain local payers or Medicare or Medicaid. We're just seeing the trend continues to be that there are more things that need prior auth. What that has also done in terms of trend is that it's actually kind of worsened turnaround times. Because I mean, it should be expected that as you scale up the requirements, more incoming volume is coming at the payers, and they are limited in resources themselves. As much as they want to do utilization management, they don't have enough resources to put against it, which means that the turnaround time trend seems to worsen, right? And to the point where I think the AMA is now, I think AMA has kind of gone beyond saying it's broken. I mean, if you look at the latest surveys that they've published over the last few years, I mean, the numbers have just ramped up to now 88% of providers think that it is the number one issue from a regulatory perspective. So it used to be, I would say, top 3, top 5 issues, but over the last couple of years, I would say it's kind of raced to the top. It seems like an outright winner in terms of regulatory burden and problems for physicians, including burnout. So I think overall, just from a regulatory perspective, the trends seem to be worsening. And I think the other trend area that's interesting, which we see with our customers that continue to happen, is that as this trend has increased, of course, we've had the great resignation and the resource challenge in healthcare. And it seems to have particularly hit the front office, especially with small, medium-sized practices, and even large hospitals. And what we're seeing is those staff that were actually kind of involved in kind of handling all the patient financial clearance functions, including prior auth, now are highly burdened. In essence, kind of being able to deal with prior authorization as an add-on burden. So we're seeing, I think most of the customers we talk to, most of the providers we talk to, essentially, they're all looking for a solution. Even though there is a regulatory, hopefully there is a regulatory fix in the future, so we can all hope for that. But in the meanwhile, I think all providers are looking for tactical fixes, including technology and other solutions to help them kind of tide over this burden.
What are you seeing in terms of impact? I mean, we talked a little bit about how it's impacting providers, but can you touch on how we're seeing that impact patients too? Because I think that's one piece that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, I think what we don't recognize is that regulatory burdens usually end up impacting patients indirectly, right? And And I think everybody who's on this call kind of recognize it, that anytime you impact the provider front office or you impact the provider directly, you are actually impacting the patient. I mean, if you have a surgery scheduled and you essentially have the surgical procedures not authorized in time, your surgery is delayed, right? So it's not that you, so it's affecting care directly, right? And I think roughly, I would say at this point in time, a large percentage of physicians, well above 80, continue to say that prior authorization interferes with kind of continuity of care, right? In many cases, we are seeing prior authorization requirements, which essentially are for continued care, where you've kind of done some of the other modalities in the past, and you're trying to do kind of a newer modality, and you need to kind of figure out how to document all of that and provide. So essentially, all of that takes time. Patients usually end up with reschedules. In many cases, actually, partially things are approved, partially things are not approved. I mean, I was reading on some of the latest data that I'm seeing in oncology, where certain parts of a chemo is approved and certain parts are not, which leads to incomplete care or in HIV care. So these are kind of scenarios that we are seeing where it actually either directly delays the patient care, or in some cases actually forces physicians to kind of go down the route of suboptimal care. Now, we all recognize that it all has the right intentions with respect to managing utilization of very expensive procedures, but today, again, the trend we're seeing is that it's no longer limited to very expensive procedures.
Right.
A lot of procedures that don't fall in that gamut actually continue to now get under the purview of prior authorization. So I think the more things get impacted by prior authorization, the wider the gamut becomes, the slower the process becomes, which means a larger cohort of population is getting impacted. Earlier, maybe we could say a small cohort of population was getting impacted because they were on some very expensive drugs or investigational drugs. But in today's world, I think anybody falling down, having a sprain, needing an MRI really might be delayed in care because an orthopedic needs an image, and you don't get an image until you get a product. So,
Right.
so we're talking about average patient getting impacted significantly in this process.
What about technology? What advances are we starting to see within the authorization space that can help alleviate some of this burden?
Yeah, so I've kind of good news and bad news. The bad news, I'll start with bad news, as I've been told about bad news first. The bad news is that the industry continues to struggle with a lack of cohesive standards associated to prior authorization. And this has persisted since the days that I worked for some large payers, working on standards around prior authorization utilization management. We continue to see that there are no clear standards associated to interfacing with the payer, or any standards that the payers themselves have to support. So while we see a significant portion of claim getting actually automated in the early part of the decade, and over the last 5 years, we have seen significant portion of the patient financial clearance process, primarily eligibility and benefits, starting to get better with respect to automation. In most cases, most of the large providers are able to give you an estimate of your care when you go to a physician. Prior auth continues to be challenged for the lack of standardization. So that unfortunately is the bad news. The good news is that all the providers that are looking for solutions, essentially, we've been able to kind of what I call weave together solutions that can actually handle different standards across the payers. So some payers are much more mature and have the ability to get direct prior authorization with them via 278 or other standards. Some of them force you down their portals. Some of them want you to e-fax it. What we have realized is that the channels and methodologies may differ, but somebody like Infinix can help kind of normalize those channels from a provider perspective. So that's one area where we have seen that we are starting to have some success being able to connect into the payers. The other thing that I want to say, good news, is that we are seeing some of the large benefit managers who actually are proxies to the underlying utilization management functions on behalf of the payers are starting to wake up and realize, wait a minute, I think we need to engage and we need to support implementation of standards. So that is a very positive sign. But last but not least, some of the newer standards that are coming up for integration, particularly things like FHIR and others, we are seeing payers starting to have some adoption on it. I had a very good conversation with the interoperability lead at Humana about possibilities of integration and Humana supporting direct interface for prior authorization. So I'm somewhat enthused that into the future it looks good that even though there is not one industry standard set up, based on kind of the whole industry kind of coalescing around FHIR as a interoperability standard may help prior auth in the long run from a technology perspective. But in the meanwhile, I mean, at least at Infinx, we've figured out how to connect these disparate sources in some shape or form. Right. And I kind of always give the analogy that I think if you're looking for your package to come from Amazon, it may come in a blue truck, it may come in a Camry, it may come in a UPS truck. Usually gets there, but usually gets there. So we've been able to kind of figure out whether to get a blue van or a brown truck to bring the package, but make it work. So that's the best we can do at this point in time. But that's where the industry stands as we think about prior auth.
It sounds like there's hopefully some hope on the horizon. So
yeah, as I said, there is light. I just hope it's not a train.
Right.
And then end of that tunnel.
In healthcare, it could be either one.
Yes.
Sure. What advice do you have for providers right now to improve auth approvals?
Yeah, I think my advice is know what you need auth for. That list keeps changing, but there are fine solutions that can help you. I mean, I always kind of break auth down into three kind of components of authorization. I think the first question is, do you need an auth? The second question is, what do you need for an auth? Submit it, initiate it, then how soon can you get it, right? So when you think about, do you need an auth? I think the ability to have a good track on things that need authorization is important for providers, because it eliminates a ton of work where you may be calling BCBS and staying on the line for 30 minutes just to know something doesn't need authorization or something was never on the plan for authorization, right? So and unfortunately those rules are very opaque. There isn't a website, you can't log on to something and say, hey, tell me this needs auth or not. So if we can solve for that, that's kind of the first thing if providers can get an answer. Second thing is initiate auth with as complete of an information set as possible. What we've realized is that the more we see prior auth being submitted with that incomplete information, it goes into a big utilization management review, right? And what reviews do is essentially delay the process, because essentially you need a nurse to review it. So if you can submit complete information, in many cases, you can actually submit complete information and answer survey questions online and get approvals in most scenarios. So use online channels as much as possible. Avoid the phone waits are terrible across the board. So suggest use phone as a last resort and use technology as much as possible to initiate. And then look for solutions that can help you initiate those as much as possible through technology, right? And then last but not least, I would say again, follow up online. Only reach out when you either get a denial or you're not able to get service before the patient is scheduled, right? Those are scenarios you want to pick up the phone and talk to the payer, but in most scenarios, if you've submitted electronically, you should be able to follow up electronically, you can get the information. So I would say use as much of the electronic channels as possible, know what requires prior authorization, and last but not least, I would say um, have complete information, right? You always have your information available in your EMR, your physician has documented it. In most cases, what we see is prior auths are either denied, peer reviewed, or delayed because information is incomplete.
Good tips. About denials, patient access, prior auths remain one of the top sources of denials. How can we avoid those?
Yeah, I'd say get prior auth before you send claims. It's the best way to avoid denial. Easier said than done.
Yeah, right.
Given
Exactly.
the challenges that I mentioned. But again, I think there isn't a simple fix other than the fact that know what needs prior auth. In most cases, since we do revenue cycle for a lot of our customers, we are surprised how, as you said, prior auth still sits in the top 3 for denials. And it's the most hardest denial to overturn. Payers can legitimately deny any part of the fees associated to it because of prior auth. So the number one thing I would say to avoid denials is know what requires prior auth, right? Do not assume, do not create tribal rules. That we've seen this in some of our customers that we've actually worked with, where you've had the little sticky notes around the monitor that says BCBS MA for this does not require prior auth. Now, guess what? BCBS MA changes their rules every quarter. So if you missed it and you forgot to call BCBS MA on that one CPT, you're going to get a denial in the backend. So constantly be up to date. Second thing is know your guidelines. Easier said than done. Again, I apologize again because I'm trying to prescribe things. It seems like they're very easy. At Infinix, what we did, we've had to apply AI and machine learning across a lot of these things to actually kind of collate. I mean, you would not believe. You would say, oh, if there is a procedure, I should know what policy or guideline applies. It's not that easy. The policy may be applicable from either the home plan, or it could be applicable from a third party that they've contracted, like an Avicor or a name specialty. So you have to know who is actually responsible for the prior auth or the UM. What policies are they going to apply, right? So what we've done is we've built a very comprehensive guideline kind of search mechanism for our customers where they can kind of look at least for the top specialties that we support, that you look up and you find what guidelines. So know your guidelines so that you can submit complete information. Because if you have the information, most of the times it's actually initiating and getting an auth is not that difficult online. But if you don't know what requires auth, or if you do not initiate it with complete information, is when you run into troubles with denials.
And I should mention the tool that you're talking about is actually just a free solution that we offer. So you can visit our website to get access to that. What are your best, give us the best of your best authorization tips and tricks?
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on some of them. I think one of them I would say is do not assume something requires auth or do not require auth. Those rules keep changing. So if you're going to build a knowledge base of some kind to do that, make sure that knowledge base can be refreshed very easily. At Infinix, we realized that we could not refresh that knowledge base with just kind of human knowledge. So we had to go off and build kind of pattern analysis, machine learning to kind of just understand what requires prior authorization. And we constantly have that be checked and QA'd and audited by people to just kind of make sure that it is correct, right? So knowing it accurately as to what requires prior auth is critical, and keeping a knowledge base and repository around it is important. Second thing is always look for an electronic means to do prior authorization. Now, even smaller payers, even Medicare, and even some of the Medicaid vendors are starting to support prior authorization online. It's a little cumbersome because you have to go establish a credential individually with each one of them, but it is worth your time. It will pay off in the long run. make sure you set up the credentials. Many of the top national payers are getting pretty good at their websites being a good source of prior authorization information. So I would say do it online. And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but if you know your guidelines, then it's a 5-minute thing to get it, because in most cases, especially high frequency procedures, you end up seeing requirements to answer and address clinical questions and clinical information about the patient that lets you to get a prior auth. I would say those are the best things that can come up.
All right, last question I've got for you. We've already got one question in the Q&A, but while I'm asking this, if you've got questions, you can go ahead and pop those in the Q&A. Let's break out your magic 8-ball. What are your predictions in terms of auth tech trends in 2023?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of trend is going to be a combination of regulatory pressure from Congress combined with technology progression. I truly believe at the end of the day, I recognize the value proposition of utilization management. You don't want expensive procedures being prescribed willy-nilly by providers. But I always keep talking about the fact that prior authorization is actually a exception finding problem, right? In most cases, if you statistically plot all procedures being performed, they fall into what I would call a normal distribution, right? The goal is to find the extremes of any scenario, right? But today what we do is we subject the entire statistical gamut to the same process that you should handle the exception. Now, my view is that if you can get smart about finding those exceptions, then it essentially means that you can actually limit the things that you need to do for prior auth. So what do I mean by that? If you can identify the cohort that actually seems to abuse the system in some shape or form in overprescription, you can actually get better with it. Now, there is a lot of pattern analysis that you can actually do on data to come up with that data, with that information, that insight. I can see payers moving more and more towards it. I see more of an integrated interface coming in the future. I believe, like us at Infinx and others, we can take the prior auth, what I call to the edge, which means at the point of service or at the point of clinical care. My utopian view is physician is prescribing, he's writing his notes, he says here is a procedure to be performed, it pops up a requirement for a prior auth, it automatically evaluates. We have enough machine learning, natural language processing to evaluate the machine notes to know if it meets clinical guideline, and it just approves. If it doesn't, it asks the question back to the physician, hey, what about this and the other thing that may be required for meeting guidelines, gets the physician's input to decide prior auth. And I think that's going to be a combination of technology getting to the edge, getting better integration into the EMR, but also I believe regulatory pressure, like we've had some early stage ONC CMS work being done in the space that pushes the payers to actually kind of limit this to only finding the delta. The one other area where we are, again, another example of that regulatory pressure is kind of the Texas Gold Card rule, which was just approved in the Texas House and Senate in 2022, which says that if a physician has done 20 plus authorizations in this last 6 months and has more than 90% approval, then they should be exempt, right? So I see more and more, if it doesn't get done at the federal level, more and more states looking for these kinds of solutions where they say, hey, go find the outlier, don't subject the entire population to the same rules.
So along that same line, one of our questions is the American, or the Association for Clinical Oncology, has submitted a proposal to Congress to review the whole prior auth concept and how it's affecting patient care. You talked a little bit about oncology earlier, but this person would like to know, what solutions are you proposing?
Yeah, I think the HR 3173, which is kind of I think it's kind of called the Seniors Timely Access Act, which
Yeah.
I think in the prior CMS also tried to do something in the Medicare law to kind of introduce some changes into prior auth. The way I kind of look at it is that what it's going to look for is timeliness, and it's going to look for turnaround time. And when I think about a technology solution like Infinix, our goal would be to be at that edge for the provider, to be able to capture that information as quickly as the physician is creating an order to get it over to the payer. We believe that we can actually disambiguate the information in a form that the payer can immediately identify if it's an outlier or not. And more importantly, payers will be forced with this process to at least publish rules that clearly identify something needs prior auth or not. So at the point of kind of that order, if we could quickly say, hey, it doesn't need prior auth, and I'll tell you, 40% of transactions that we get through our platform today doesn't require a prior auth. So if we could identify that at the point of service, at the point of schedule, we could eliminate the need for any further action. But even if it gets into, hey, an auth is required, if we can disambiguate that information for the payer in a form that the payer can immediately identify if it's an outlier or not, whether that is in the form of the physician information or the number of prior history transactions, that would actually make it much easier to get that prior auth, I would say, as near real time as possible.
Next question we've got. This seems like the $1 million question. If we knew this, that would be phenomenal. But can you discuss what is the motivation of plans to deny prior auth requests? Is it a slow play and delay the process so they can hold their funds, or is it to, and protect, as in quotes here, understandably, patients?
Yeah, I struggle with the question. Full transparency for the audience, I used to work for a payer for a long period of time, help build some of the utilization management system. I do not want to, I mean, I've been in some of these, I've been in the inner workings of some of these conversations. It's usually not driven by, I'll be very honest, if payers really wanted to slow down and hold on to funds, the best way is to delay claims, because that you put a claim cycle from 45 to 50 days can increase your funds significantly in terms of reserves. So just a little tip. So prior auth doesn't play that much of a role. I think the problem is the motivation on their side is there is this assumption that physicians are trying to overprescribe things, and our goal is to hold them to their lines. So it ain't about the patient, which is kind of the problem here. It's all about trying to say, hey, let's reduce utilization because we believe utilization is over the line. So in many cases, the denials, I'll be very honest, most denials occur primarily because of incomplete information. We at Infinix, and in my past life at a payer, I've seen that 95% of the denials are overturned at a peer review. Now that peer review comes at a very expensive cost. If you had a surgeon who had to step out for 30 minutes to have a call with the medical director at Aetna to get that approval, that was surgical time lost, right? And in most cases, it just happens that when the surgeon explains what he needs, it gets approved. And so why did it go through this process? So a little secret. In most cases, payer reviews are done in multiple levels. The first level is done by nurses. And in most cases, if the information is not complete, the nurses are not authorized to actually make a approved decision. So they have to put it into a peer review to have a medical director talk, right? So when in doubt, assume negative intent is kind of how the system is built. So in most cases, please make sure if you get submitting complete information usually gets you the authorization. There isn't a clear motive to just deny it for the sake of denying it.
Who should we as providers use to apply legal leverage to obtain a drug? What does the law say about using a drug off-label for a patient who has not responded to an on-label agent?
Yeah, so I think from a legal leverage, I'm not sure about the legal leverage aspect of it, so I can't kind of really speak to it. But in terms of in terms of on-label versus off-label, we have seen this problem. Some payers are so it varies by payers. Certain payers are as long as you've shown kind of a step therapy model where you've kind of used a certain brand or a generic that has not produced the results that you need to go to an expensive branded drug work. Some payers by default assume that you can actually work, and they do not provide an authorization for off-label drug. In most cases, they will say go to a biosimilar of some kind. But in most cases, if you have shown prior treatment using a biosimilar that did not produce efficacy, then you have a very good chance of actually getting an authorization for a branded drug. But many of the payers, usually their first default answer is to go for a biosimilar of some kind that's on their approved list, because they've come to the conclusion that's what holds on utilization. So unfortunately, not a very good answer, but I am not aware of the legal aspects of it, but because the guidelines control those. But if you can show data that shows the lack of efficacy, you usually can get approval on it.
Good. And we just had one comment, which I think you and I would both agree with, but prior authorization is beyond prescription or procedures. Cancer patients require genetic tests on samples that cannot wait long. Prior auth delays, and we lose these samples integrity. So
yeah, we have a lot of lab providers who work with us, and we kind of see that challenge all the time. In most cases, providers usually default towards patients than dollars. And what that many cases they will proceed with the sample processing. And what we've been successful, especially in the lab space, is to get retro authorization, or at least hold payers to retro authorization as long as it's submitted in the right amount of time. So given the sample situation, in most cases, what we have done with our lab customers is to simultaneously submit for prior authorization while the sample is being processed, with the assumption that as long as we've submitted for prior authorization, we get a retro on the prior auth, even though the sample has been processed. And we have seen good success with it. But again, the other problem is a lot of genetic is considered investigational, so it ends up having a higher denial percentages as it stands today.
Another question here: why does United Healthcare deny every claim the first time it's submitted?
I apologize, but I don't have a good answer. We see the same pattern. We've seen it's kind of the airline industry to some degree. If you remember, I think it was United which said you have to pay for baggage, and we all balked at it, and we said, "Oh my God!" And then everybody followed suit, right? So unfortunately, the large payers are like an oligopoly; they all follow suit, so to speak. And we see United becoming actually far more tighter with their utilization management. I would say even in the last 3 to 6 months, we have had scenarios where customers have been asked to produce screenshots and other evidences to prove that an authorization wasn't required for a procedure that they know doesn't require authorization. So we are held to kind of evidence requirements of answering to it. So I don't have a good answer. We're seeing the same patterns that you are seeing with respect to United. But again, if we do it on the web, we've seen that we can do high throughput processing with them. If we have the right information, we can get through the process pretty quickly. United is pretty good at knowing whether auth is required online also. So use the online tools from Optum as frequently as possible. Do not assume that just because you know something from United did not require prior auth in the past, that it will not require your claim will get rejected if you don't have. In most cases, we are actually submitting evidence for no auth required. In many cases in the past, we have only submitted evidence for auth required in terms of referral numbers. We are actually capturing and managing in our platform evidence for no auth required for United in particular, because of this issue that we're seeing with that.
Good. I talked to our one of our coding managers yesterday, and she, as it pertains to coding, but was talking about the fact that with a lot of the technology, particularly EMR technology, that sometimes it's easy to get a little bit lazy in the system and not document everything. So this is another one of those cases. It sounds like you're saying the same thing. Just make sure you've got the documentation and everything to support the prior auth.
Absolutely. And in most cases, it may be just an oversight or something was not incorporated, because most of the times the machine behind the Iron Curtain is trying to look for a very specific fixed set of words. And if it doesn't find those words, it then drops it into some kind of a peer review denial, right? It's kind of a default approach. So getting those words, getting those attributes that are very important. So knowing what the guidelines are very critical. It's important to know guidelines on your high frequency procedures, so you know what information needs to be submitted.
Good advice. I think those are all the questions we've got for you, Navaneeth. Thanks as always for your wisdom, for your time, and thank you to everyone who joined. We hope you join us back here next week. We're going to be talking about our new free solution, just like our guidelines tool. We've got a new coding acceleration solution that we're going to be talking about next week and how that can help. So hope to see you back here next week. Have a great day. Thanks again, Navaneeth.
Thank you, Kate. Everybody have a great day.